So I will go ahead and mute myself and I'll watch the chat box and I will turn it over to you, Clayne.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie, and welcome everybody to week 6 of my 7-week seminar series on soil fertility. If you do have any questions, it's a pretty small group tonight. I'm seeing 29. Please ask them. I want to get your questions answered either in the chat, or if you're more comfortable, just unmute yourself and ask away. If you do have any questions after the presentation, always feel free to give me a call at 994-6076 or send me an email at clanej@montana.edu. So today I'm going to cover nutrient management for sustainable, resilient, climate-smart agriculture. And what I'm going to cover in this webinar is, first, I'm going to present the tools we have to build healthy soils. Second, I'll specifically discuss how to build soil organic matter because it has so many ripple effects on soil health. You have higher soil organic matter, you generally have more microbial activity, better aggregation, faster infiltration rates, more water holding capacity. So that's why I focus on organic matter. I'm going to talk about why soil acidification is a threat to healthy soils in Montana and how to prevent that. I'll present on crop rotations that minimize nitrogen loss, specifically focused on leaching, and I'll show options and benefits of crop diversification. So there's a number of agronomic tools that we can use to help the soil. And those include things like crop residue, leaving more stubble, tillage versus no tillage, where generally no-till improves soil health more than tillage, cropping intensity, rotations and diversity, adding nutrients or adding amendments. And, you can think about, what else can you think about for your specific situation? And all of these interact together to affect water, wind. Well, wind affects the soil. All of these can affect temperature, and of course, all of them can affect soil life. So some goals, some in the field, large acreage type goals. Some of these include minimizing disturbance, keeping the soil surface covered, and keeping a living root in the soil. But what can we measure that these different goals relate to? One would be SOM, or soil organic matter, soil nitrogen, or PMN, which is an abbreviation for potentially mineralizable nitrogen, microbes and enzyme activity, aggregation, which means the clumping of soil into small little pieces that end up allowing roots and air and water to move through those aggregates, infiltration, which gets water off your field, meaning down rather than over, which an over is bad because that can cause erosion, soil pH, and yield and protein being kind of the end recipients of all these soil health measures. I would say that the basis for soil health is biological activity, and that organic matter is the fuel for that activity. When microbes die apart is recycled as readily available nutrients, which is something you want for your vegetables or your crops. The rest can end up associated or tied to mineral surfaces, meaning the mineral, the sand, silt, and clay part of your soil, which protects it from decomposing. And that end product is called soil organic matter. That long-lived pool is what's especially important for soil structure. So kind of that stable pool of soil organic matter, rather than say a pea leaf or a recently decomposed worm, things that don't stick around very long. They can all improve. Higher soil organic matter can improve water holding capacity, soil structure, and that term that I talked about the first day, cation exchange capacity. And all of those combine determine soil fertility, nutrient availability, and the health of your plants. One thing that I find quite interesting is that relatively small changes in soil organic matter can cause some pretty large changes in other parameters. So I think my intuition would say if soil organic matter goes up by 10%, maybe things like infiltration or aggregation or biological activity go up by 10%. There's more work showing that there's what would be called like a threshold effect, where small changes in soil organic matter can cause big changes in other parameters. So here what I'm showing is soil organic matter in percent in the top 4 inches of a range of soils that either were treated to have high amounts of residue or the residue was removed. And the effect of that change in soil organic matter on what's called water stable aggregates. So aggregates that can take a raindrop and not fall apart. That's the type of aggregate we really want. Notice that with soil organic matters that increase from, say, maybe like 1.8%, maybe up to about 2%, the amount of water stable aggregates and therefore resistance to erosion, ability for water and roots and air to move through them, goes up by maybe about a factor of 2. So a small change in organic matter down in this range can cause a really big improvement in physical properties of the soil. Once we get up to about 4% or so, increasing soil organic matter looks like it doesn't continue to improve aggregation, but it really makes a difference down here, which is where a lot of Montana soils are. Rotations. So increasing cropping frequency, meaning how many crops do you have, say, in a 3 or 4 year period, can really increase soil organic matter. So this is work done in southeast Saskatchewan from about 1960 up to about 2010, where soil organic matter in the top 6 inches in tons per acre was measured. The orange line here is fallow wheat. The purplish line is fallow wheat, so more intense. And then continuous wheat is in yellow, this top curve. So notice by increasing the cropping intensity from fallow wheat to fallow wheat, the soil organic matter goes up a little. By moving to continuous wheat, it actually goes up substantially. A little closer to home, especially my home, this is 4 miles to my west right now, near Bozeman, Montana, is a long-term cropping system study led by my colleague Perry Miller and soil sampled by my colleague Stephanie Ewing in 2016. Here, what was measured was soil organic matter, again in tons per acre, for 7 different cropping systems. Those include tilled fallow, no-till fallow, continuous wheat, pea grain followed by wheat, pea hay, a pea cover crop, and then a system that was CRP, so an alfalfa grass mix for 10 years, and then converted in the last 4 years to pea grain. What really stands out to me is this continuous wheat system had the highest amount of soil organic matter. The CRP system, followed by pea grain, had the highest amount also. It was about tied, and it had the highest amount for both kind of a high nitrogen fertilizer treatment and a half nitrogen fertilizer treatment. Where in the continuous wheat, it was mainly good in this high treatment, and the soil organic matter wasn't as high in the half treatment. The loser here would be tilled fallow. So tillage breaks up those aggregates, that exposes organic matter. Microbes can then break down that organic matter. So tilled fallow tends to have about the lowest organic matter, no-till recrop, and especially no-till perennial systems have the highest soil organic matter. The red dashed line shows the soil organic matter back in 2002 when we started this project. So another thing it shows is that it takes a long time to build soil organic matter. So if you want higher soil organic matter in, say, 10 or 20 years, you really need to start changing your system now if it's not as high as you would like. In that same study, trying to figure out, well, why was there such big differences in soil organic matter, say between tilled fallow and continuous wheat and CRP? We really, by we, my colleague Rick Engel and I and some others, really pinned that down to how much residue was left behind. And that probably makes a lot of sense to you. And that if you just leave more stubble behind, you're probably going to build more soil organic matter. So this graph shows residue input in tons per acre per year on the horizontal axis and the 10-year total soil organic matter change in tons per acre on the y-axis. Actually, I'm pretty sure this is, yeah, this is tons per acre on the y-axis. Yep. Um, and what it shows is, except for that CRP system where a lot of the soil organic matter was created by those deep roots that perennial systems have, this is above ground residue input. So the above ground residue input had a very linear response with soil organic matter. So the more residue left behind, the more the soil organic matter built up, the less that it left behind, the more that soil organic matter actually dropped. So another question might be, oh yeah, so what that one thing that allows us to do is calculate what's called a threshold residue input. So what we found, at least for this site west of Bozeman, was that it took about 1.8 tons per acre per year to exactly maintain soil organic matter. So it took quite a bit um, of residue input to maintain soil organic matter. Another thing that we can learn from this chart is what percent of soil residue carbon was still in the soil after 10 years. And it turns out it's about 40%. So about 40% of residue is left behind. Where does the other 60% go? Well, it's decomposed by microbes and goes up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So that's just kind of a rough rule of thumb for Montana. 40% stays behind, at least based on this study. So the best way to build soil organic matter would be either to recrop, also apply recommended rates. So the recommended rates, notice they generally produce higher soil organic matter, but not always, or by growing perennials. Notice how the perennial system, the CRP forage system, also grew soil organic matter. If you do want more information on soil health in general, I would suggest going to the National Center for Appropriate Technologies Soil Health Innovation Conference, which will be 1 month from now, and it's going to be virtual at this webpage. You can register. Producers pay $50, everyone else pays $75. And it's going to be quite a range of presentations. Any questions so far?
I didn't see any come through on the chat.
Okay, I'm just going to leave a little bit of time just because people have told me don't move on too fast. It takes a while to type a good question. Some of the topics that will be at this Soil Health Innovation Conference are everything from connections between soil health and human health. There's going to be talks on the effects of management practices on soil health. There'll be range systems using remote sensing, policy. So it's quite a diverse group of topics. All right, I am going to move on, but I'll continue to monitor the chat, as will Julie. So now moving on to soil acidification. So soil acidification, just since 2015, has become a pretty major problem in parts of Montana, resulting in aluminum toxicity, which seems to start somewhere below pH 5.2. This is a safflower field near Big Sandy, where all the areas where safflower simply was not growing had pHs below 5. The green areas where it was doing pretty well had pHs above 5. And I did get a question that I want to tackle before I move on. In the last slide, where you need more than 1.8 tons per acre residue to maintain soil organic matter, was that in a continuous cropping system or what? So that was across cropping systems. So meaning that we plotted all of the data from those 2 fallow systems, 4 recrop systems, 2 of which one was hayed and one was a cover and then a perennial. So all the points are here, and it didn't really seem to matter whether it was recrop or fallow. but 1.8 tons per acre per year was the threshold to maintain soil organic matter. Thanks for the question. Let's see if there's any other questions. Thank you for posting the MCAT soil health. Great. Okay. So other things that low pH can do are impair herbicide action. So most herbicides do pretty well near neutral pH. Sometimes at lower pH, they stick around too long and can impact a crop that you weren't intending to impact. And sometimes their effectiveness goes down. Also, legumes that have those nice nodules on their roots end up not nodulating as well below pH 6, and often then not nitrogen fixation drops dramatically both for alfalfa and also pulse crops below pH 6. Some people have seen increased disease like ceph stripe when pH drops below 6. And all of this combined results in yield loss, eventually soil organic matter loss. You can picture you're not returning any residue in these areas, and a loss of resiliency to change. So I'm just going to play a video. So I just wanted to give you an introduction to that video to give you a flavor from a farmer's perspective on soil pH, and it's really affecting his farm. You can watch the whole video another time. I see no audio on the video, no sound. Hmm. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, none on the video. Sorry about that. Um, Let me just go back to the link. So this link, you can hear it. Also, you can find it on my YouTube channel, and you can listen to Brent Hanford's experience with low pH. So, a question for you, and I'd like you to answer in the chat box, would be, have you found low pH in some portions of fields? If you're a crop advisor on your clients' fields, if you're a producer, have you or your crop advisor or extension agent found low pH? So what I'd like you to do is put yes or no. I'm seeing some yeses, a 5.5, a yes, 2, which means no. So a few people are saying no, a few people are saying uh, yes. Okay, looks about evenly mixed. Thank you. So what are some agronomic reasons for low soil pH? One would be ammonium-based nitrogen fertilizer due to nitrification. And that process is caused by ammonium or urea fertilizer mixing with air and water to form nitrate and acid. Another thing that can make this problem worse is the leaching loss of nitrate. If there's less nitrate uptake, nitrate is an anion, so it has a negative charge. That means that there will be less root release of what's called basic anions, so hydroxide or bicarbonate, that end up buffering or raising the pH. Also, crop residue removal. So if you graze or if you hay down to close to the ground or you remove most of your stubble, that removes a lot of what's called base cations, calcium, magnesium, and potassium that all can buffer pH change. And then lack of deep tillage concentrates acidity where the nitrogen fertilizer was applied. This is work from that same study that I was showing soil organic matter from in a site west of Bozeman, where I'm plotting cumulative nitrogen input over a long-term study against soil pH in the top 4 inches. What we found was that as cumulative nitrogen input increased, pH decreased, which exactly agrees with that equation that I showed on the previous slide. In an organic green manure wheat system, we had our highest pH, and down here we had our continuous wheat system, which would have had its highest nitrogen rate. What we found over 14 years was that every 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre ended up dropping the pH by about 0.04 pH units. So that might not sound awful if you're not applying high rates of nitrogen. However, on another site up near Big Sandy, in 8 years, each 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre dropped the pH by 0.14 pH units, so a much steeper drop. We think the biggest difference was that this silt loam soil has a finer texture and a higher organic matter than the Big Sandy soil, which was a sandy loam with less organic matter and therefore less ability to buffer a pH drop. This is pretty scary to me because it won't take many years until this soil has toxic levels of aluminum in it. So which systems in that long-term study near Bozeman dropped pH the most and which dropped it the least? Here I have soil pH in the top 4 inches on the vertical axis. The, the pH in the continuous wheat system really stands out. So continuous wheat, because it's getting high rates of nitrogen every year, had by far the lowest pH levels. The pH in these, or the amount of nitrogen that was applied in these systems are shown in the lower part of these bars. So wheat system over 14 years had a lot of nitrogen applied, 2,000 pounds of nitrogen per acre. These higher pH systems, like the fallow systems, the pea grown for grain, the CRP system, notice they had substantially lower amounts of nitrogen applied. The, the bars that I just showed were from 2016. The bars on the right, these bars here, are from 2020. So notice that in every case, the pH dropped somewhere between about 1/10 of a pH unit, maybe 1/4 of a pH unit. This one's a little hard to see, but this was about 4/10 of a pH unit. So in this continuous wheat system. So again, these drops are gradual but alarming in that it won't take many more years for this system, especially, to have a pH that is likely toxic. Do you know if any work has been done with biochar as a soil amendment for acid soils? I do know about a proposal in North Dakota that's looking at biochar. I'm not aware of any work in Montana or not. And I got a question, is that pounds of actual N or pounds of urea? It's pounds of actual N. And so it might seem like a lot for most of Montana, but this is in an area where we can typically grow 60 to 90 bushels of wheat. And that's why we have such high amounts of nitrogen applied. So what do I recommend that crop advisors and producers do? One would be to scout, to map, and a soil test. So by using aerial imagery, just regular photography, say from a drone or from Google Earth, or from NDVI, which is an, an index that can be used from drones or satellites. And what it shows is some pretty dramatic differences in color on acidified fields. That can then be used to go in and target these areas and find out, well, how low is the pH? And would these be areas that are more conducive to liming, for example, than these areas? Strongly recommend field testing or lab testing, both bad and good areas. There's an instrument called Varus, which can map pH, and you can also measure pH with what's called a pH stick by hand. Mix a little soil and water slurry at the bottom of a pit. Do keep in mind here that pH varies seasonally and annually, so I would strongly recommend that you test from the same area and the same time of year by the same lab using the same method to make sure that what you're seeing is actually a trend and not just random fluctuations.
On that previous slide, we have a question. Is that actual pounds of N or pounds of urea on that?
Yes, I thought I had answered that. These are actual pounds of nitrogen.
That's what I thought. I was just double checking.
So one question might be, why did this problem sneak up on us? Meaning in 2014, I didn't know it existed. In 2015, we started hearing reports of low pH. One issue is that typically a field is sampled in maybe 6 or 8 locations. Those soil samples are put in a bucket, mixed, put into a bag, and sent off to a lab. By mixing areas of a field that might have, say, pH 6 with other areas of field that might have pH 4.8, you can kind of get a false sense that your pH is okay when it really isn't. And that's one of the reasons that this problem did sneak up on us. The other thing is the lowest pH is actually in the top 2 or 3 inches. Typically, the top 6 inches is sampled, and it can be a lot higher in that 3 to 6 inch range than 0 to 3. That can end up masking the problem as well. So I recommend sampling just the top 3 inches, which is going to have the lowest pH to look for this problem. So what are some things you can do as producers or crop advisors to prevent acidification? One would be anything you can do to increase nitrogen use efficiency, making every pound of nitrogen count, meaning get taken up by your crop rather than not. Something else that can be done is changing your nitrogen source, moving them from the more acidifying sources like monoammonium phosphate, ammonium sulfate, diammonium phosphate, which isn't used much in Montana. And then next down on this list, all of these are the same. Urea, 28 solution, ammonium nitrate, and anhydrous, pound of nitrogen produce the same pounds of acid. Calcium, ammonium nitrate, acidifies only about 1/3 as much as urea, and that's because it has some lime within the product. Potassium nitrate doesn't acidify at all. It actually raises the pH, but it's very expensive. And then legumes and manure don't seem to acidify much, if at all. Another advantage of legumes is by having them in rotation, you don't need any nitrogen fertilizer the year that they're grown, and then a little bit often gets left for the next crop, so you can maybe back off on nitrogen. And legume residue happens to have higher surface pH, higher pH in the residue than non-legumes. Something else you can do, as I mentioned, residue has a lot of calcium, magnesium, buffering cations in them. So by leaving more of that crop residue in the field, you should be able to buffer quite a bit more acid than by removing that residue. What's some other management more specific to prevent acidification? So I mentioned increasing nitrogen fertilizer use efficiency. Ways to do that are soil tests for nitrogen closer to the application time and closer to the growing season. Also, make sure you have enough phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. If you don't, your crop won't be limited by nitrogen and it will waste nitrogen. I strongly recommend using a conservative pre-plant rate, so applying a little less nitrogen than maybe your crop would need in an average year. And then if it rains, apply a little bit more, either top dressing or maybe a liquid foliar application. Applying nitrogen close to peak crop uptake will help. Using variable site-specific nitrogen rates, so not over applying, say in areas that are already becoming acidic and maybe have a lot of excess nitrogen. Anything you can do to reduce nitrogen leaching or using legumes or manure for a nitrogen source and possibly using less acidifying nitrogen sources, but they are pretty expensive. Something else you can do is plant perennial forages. So perennial forages in this study in North Dakota over from 2007 to 2011 gradually increased the pH compared to continuous spring wheat, which gradually decreased the pH. So by the second year of this study, there was actually a significant difference in pH between a perennial forage and spring wheat, and that seemed to grow as the study went on. Question I got from Dwight was, does safflower residue have a higher pH level? I don't know the answer to that. I can try to get an answer for you though. So those are ways to prevent. What if you already have this low pH? It's a little too late to prevent. So there you have to either adapt or fix the problem, mitigate. So ways to adapt would be to plant aluminum or low pH tolerant species or varieties. So for example, spring wheat has an alum, or I was just trying to think of another one. It starts with L and it was on the tip of my tongue. Somebody will answer for me. Lanning. So Lanning is quite low pH tolerant as well, and it used to just be grown in Montana, and now it's being grown in acid fields in North Dakota. Seed placing phosphorus, even in high phosphorus soils, has been found to double durum yields on acid soils. Liming, of course, is a mitigation strategy. We estimate from my colleague Rick Engel's work, it takes about 2.25 tons of calcium carbonate per acre or lime per acre to raise the pH from 4.5 to 6, so quite a bit of product. Sugar beet lime is free in Sydney and in Billings, so that's an attractive lime source in Montana. It's only about 60% calcium carbonate, so therefore you need somewhere around 3.75 tons of sugar beet lime per acre to raise the pH from 4.5 to 6. Just doing some back of the envelope calculations, a semi-truck trailer load can haul about 23 ton. So that means you could only treat about 6 acres with one semi-truck trailer load. Good news is we think that lime would last about 15 to 20 years. That's based both on some calculations and a study done in Western Canada. So I would say maybe prevention looks more appealing when you look at the cost of liming at say $145 per acre. Melinda is asking, what about liquid calcium? So liquid calcium, you have to be really clear on what that means, because some people call calcium chloride liquid calcium. Other people call liquid lime liquid calcium. So starting with the calcium chloride doesn't affect the pH at all. I would say in general, probably a waste of money. Liquid lime should have similar benefits to lime. The biggest disadvantage is you're moving a lot of water around. So actually hauling costs can be more per ton. It's probably much more expensive to buy liquid lime than to buy sugar beet lime. So just summing up, acidification, we know cropland soils are becoming acidic largely due to nitrogen fertilization, which reduces yield for several reasons. I'd strongly recommend identifying whether your fields have a problem now to slow or prevent acidification with sound management. Using crop rotations with lower nitrogen needs is likely the best way to prevent further acidification. And liming manure and planting perennials can all raise the pH. Seed place phosphorus can counter aluminum toxicity, and aerial images are great tools to target management areas. So I know of a producer who used Google Earth to variable rate apply lime on his field. He felt it worked quite well, and there's other techniques like drone imagery that can also work. What about tillage to bring up lime? When I first started addressing this issue, I thought, yeah, why haul lime when most of our soils have lime down deep? A few problems. One is you negate some of the benefits of no-till, like leaving residue. Your field's possibly going to blow more. Another issue that I feel is that you end up creating a bigger depth of low pH area. So when you do come in to eventually lime it, you have to apply more lime and apply it deeper and do a deeper tillage. Any questions so far? And thanks for keeping the questions coming. And Melinda did clarify that she means truly liquid lime rather than liquid calcium chloride, like I said, some people talk about. Any other questions before I move on? Any questions on your end, Julie? Maybe that came directly to you or that I missed in the chat.
No, I didn't see any.
Okay. Okay, on to keeping nutrients in the soil, specifically preventing leaching. So rotations are a big way to change plant available nitrogen. If we think about what we need for nitrate leaching to happen in high amounts, you need high amounts of nitrate and you need high amounts of deep percolation. So deep percolation just means water moving vertically below the root zone. In a fallow environment, we generally have higher nitrate because there hasn't been crops to take up that nitrogen, and we have higher deep percolation because there's more water because crops haven't been taking up water. Whereas a recrop field is going to have lower levels of nitrate and less water, and therefore less leaching. So including cover crops, growing a crop instead of fallow, planting deep-rooted crops, maybe a fall crop after a legume crop so that there's not so much nitrate in the soil, and supplying nitrogen with legumes, which are kind of a slow release nitrogen rather than perhaps a commercial fertilizer nitrogen where a lot of the nitrogen is released fairly quickly. One thing that can really help reduce leaching is matching crop uptake with changes in nitrogen, either from fertilization or released from the soil. So this is a graphic that shows how, for example, the soil production of nitrate will increase in the spring and summer when temperatures are warm and we're generally moist, and then soil production of nitrate falls off as soils dry out and temperatures fall off. If crop uptake occurs in a figure or a shape that looks something like this, you can picture this might be an area where there's a decent time for leaching, and then this is an area when there's a decent time for leaching because there's no crop uptake. So I'm referring to this as the brown gap, meaning where nitrogen is released by the soil greater than the crop is taking it up. Now I realize we're not in major corn soy country in Montana, but I thought this study was relevant. What I'm showing over here in the second column is the 4-year total nitrogen lost in drainage in pounds of nitrate per acre. So for this corn soy no-till system, quite a bit was lost, 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But when a winter rye cover crop was planted to fill in this brown gap, the nitrate loss dropped to 29 pounds. A similar system where in the fall the field was chisel plowed and it had kind of similar amounts as no-till. So that winter rye cover really decreased nitrate leaching. Closer to home here on crops that we grow more of in Montana. This is a study I worked on in the Judith Basin in central Montana in both 2013 and 2014. Here on the vertical axis, I plot the average estimated nitrate that's leached in pounds of nitrogen per acre for a pea that's grown for grain, followed by winter wheat in green, or a fallow winter wheat system in blue. Notice in 2013 that the pea grain followed by winter wheat had about 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre leached, whereas the fallow winter wheat system had 50. So definitely made a difference that year. This year, which had a much wetter fall going into the winter wheat crop, and it filled the soil profile with water, it seemed like the crop didn't matter nearly as much, didn't really matter at all. But in 1 of 2 years, growing a crop instead of fallow dramatically dropped leaching. What about in irrigated systems? So this is work done in Sydney, Montana, looking at a growing season from early May to mid-October and plotting groundwater nitrate, nitrogen in parts per million on the vertical axis. The maximum EPA safe rate is 10 milligrams per liter of nitrogen. A small grain, which probably has the smallest, shortest root system of these three crops, ended up having some times of year where the nitrogen levels were slightly above the drinking water standard. Sugar beet had somewhat high levels as well. It's also not super deeply rooted, but safflower, which is very deep rooted, notice it has the smallest nitrate levels of the three crops. And this was a pretty robust study, a 6-year average study. So deep rooted plants will decrease leaching. Other things that can decrease leaching would be applying nitrogen based on a spring, not a fall soil test, splitting the nitrogen application to match plant needs. And if the late spring is dry, simply don't apply that second application. Of course, avoiding fall application on shallow or coarse soils. Apply less nitrogen in areas that yield less or have shallow soils, and maybe use an enhanced efficiency fertilizer to reduce leaching losses. Any questions on anything that I've covered so far today? Okay, I'm going to move on, but I'm going to keep an eye on that chat. So on to crop diversity and kind of looking at the whole system when we think about nutrient management. So diversification generally will help with reducing risk and generally making a system more resilient to weather changes, for example. So how might you do that? So things like structural diversity in the field. So that could be leaving, say, stubble strips, genetic diversity, interspersing fields with non-crop vegetation. So especially flowering plants that can attract, say, parasitoid wasps that can end up killing wheat stem sawfly. Polyculture, so mixing species within the fields, either things like chickpea and flax are being experimented with, growing mixed cover crops, and then also mixing up winter and spring crops. Some benefits of these increases in diversity would be interrupting pest or disease cycles, buffering microclimate extremes, maybe breaking up wind, increasing production and increasing yield stability, or reducing risk. thought question for you is, would you consider using a pulse or cover crops to diversify if you haven't tried either to date? In that same study west of Bozeman, 5 miles west of Bozeman, I want to show you net profit over the period from 2013 through 2016. So this again is for those 7 different systems that I discussed. The blue triangles are when a full rate of nitrogen was applied, meaning 3 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. The red circles are when half nitrogen rate was applied. So essentially in every case, applying more nitrogen did increase profit. But the system that really stands out to me is this one. So the pea grain followed by wheat produced far more profit than any of the other systems, including the fallow systems, continuous wheat, a Hayed system, cover cross system, or the CRP system. Is pea grain different from pasture peas or cow peas? So the pea that we're growing in these studies is what's called field pea, which is different than a cow pea. It's typically grown for grain. It's sometimes grown for forage. Cow pea is a different kind of pea. So pea grown for grain followed by wheat is more profitable than any of these other 6 systems, at least in this study. Another advantage of pea grown for grain in this system is it dropped the pH less. So the initial pH in this system was 7.4. The winter wheat, or excuse me, the wheat on wheat that was applied with a full nitrogen rate dropped the pH to 6.2 as I showed in a previous graph, but the pea grain followed by wheat actually kept the pH up pretty high. And we had increased soil organic matter in that pea grain followed by wheat system. Some other things to consider that have an impact on the whole system would be that excess nitrogen can lead to acidification. Look for a weak link in your system. So for example, I'm seeing more sulfur deficiency. If you have sulfur deficiency, you're probably going to decrease nitrogen use efficiency. And keep in mind that some studies have shown that pesticides can affect the soil and root microbial community. So just think about your pesticide management systems. Some other things to think about are there are a number of soil health tests out there packaged. You can analyze things individually like enzymes, microbial biomass, but there's some group systems like Haney or the Cornell test, which is called the Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health, or the CASH test. If you're going to monitor soil health, make sure that you measure and monitor over time or maybe between fields. If you just do it once, it might show that maybe you don't have great soil health, but it might be, say, comparing with soil health from Iowa, which isn't really fair comparison. Soil health assessments can be useful to assess the effect of management or evaluate problem areas. Standardized methods may not yet be in place. I think this is a fairly young field. And there's currently no calibration between soil health test values and fertilizer recommendations for the northern Great Plains. So even though you might do a test like the Haney test and it comes back with a fertilizer recommendation, those have not been calibrated for our region. So I'd use them with caution. So how can you manage for healthy soils? First, feed the microbial community. So based on a number of medium and long-term studies, we recognize that it takes a lot of time to change soil health. But increasing cropping frequency almost always helps soil health. Cover crop biomass and the inclusion of legumes does appear to be more important than the number of species or cover crop mixture or diversity. Work done in Oregon has shown that legumes need to comprise more than about 40% of a cover crop to contribute noticeable or meaningful available soil nitrogen. So, in summary, tools towards resilient and sustainable farming would include adaptations such as development and to develop and use tolerant varieties. Secondly, to increase diversity using cropping associations, rotations, and sequences, and managing for efficient water capture, retention, and use. Building resiliency would mean building and maintaining healthy soils now with adequate fertilization, enhancing and capitalizing on natural biological processes, avoiding degradation of natural resources, and reducing reliance when possible on non-renewable inputs. So thank you. And are there any questions?
We do have one in the chat. Does NRCS know that the Haney test isn't calibrated for our region? I think it's Haney, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think some people do. I know we have at least one NRCS employee on right now. But the reason NRCS has, my understanding, has included it in at least one of their programs is to get people thinking about soil health and see if their management changes. The 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 risk is that those Haney tests do come with a fertilizer recommendation. And so I do caution to not use those. MSU has done 5 decades of soil fertility research, and we think we have a pretty good handle on fertilizer recommendations for Montana. Haney, at least as far as I know, has not been calibrated in Montana. Other questions?
While we wait for those to come in, I just put the link up for the evaluation for tonight's program. So if you would take the time to fill that out, we would really appreciate it.
Yeah, that would be great. So this talk and the next talk, we're just asking what you thought of the whole series, other topics you might want to see, how we can make remote learning, which is challenging at best, better, more effective, and improve your learning. Any other questions? I did want to announce that next week will be specifically dedicated to cover crops, nutrient cycling in cover crops, things like termination, species, how to better manage cover crops to improve yield, protein, soil health, and economics. Any other questions? All right, well, I'm going to stay on for a little bit in case people do have questions. Notice that there's more information on soil fertility here. You can also go to my presentations and listen to any of the last 6 talks now, 5 plus this one. And I do encourage everybody to stay warm. So thanks for all the great questions, and hopefully I'll see some of you next week. And I'm going to leave that survey up in the chat box. Anybody who can fill it out, I'd really appreciate it to make these programs better.